Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Barry Erickson, and I'm Community Engagement Coordinator here at Wheaton Public Library. Tonight, we are delighted to bring you Conscience of the Crusades. Matthew J. Milliner holds an MA and PhD in art history from Princeton University and a Master of Divinity degree from Princeton Theological Seminary. He's a 5-time appointee to the Curatorial Advisory Board of the United States Senate and was awarded a Commonwealth Fellowship at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. He has written for publications ranging from the New York Times to First Things and is author of Everlasting People with InterVarsity Press in 2021 and Mother of the Lamb with Fortress Press in 2022. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Milliner.
Thank you. Thanks, Barry. I think if I press cancel here, that's what we want. Don't end the webinar. Oh, good. There it goes. Hey, everybody, thanks for being here. Make yourselves comfortable. It is a big deal to come to an event like this with all the things that we have going on in our lives, and especially in the busy autumn. WWW, right? Wild Wheaton Wednesdays. Here we are again. Thank you for coming. And I want to honor your attention and your time that you took to be here by starting out with something flashy and controversial. Now, last time I met, let's hold on one second. The clicker, did I? Oh, I see. See, I pressed something. See, look at that, perfect. So last time I was here talking about a book I wrote about Native Americans and the Wheaton area, and it's called The Everlasting People. And I talked about how I was contacted by the police who said, do you want to tear down this statue of the doughboy in Wheaton because someone claiming to be you has said that you are going to get angry students to rip down these statues. And so it was a strange thing to be in contact with a Wheaton detective trying to clear my name. And I was very relieved when he said, we were too worried it was you when they spelled your name wrong. So that was okay. So I started with that. And this is sober. This is difficult to talk about these things. But I want to begin by talking about this war that is raging. And you may have noticed in this recent speech that Vladimir Putin gave, that it was something of a rhetorical tour de force attempting to galvanize this country to continue to fuel his efforts to expand what he understands to be Russia. And it was deliberately coordinated, you have to know Russian culture to understand this, with a feast of the Virgin Mary. And we're here to talk about the Virgin Mary and the Crusades, so that's why that connection is interesting. I noticed that he timed it with the Feast of the Nativity of the Virgin Mary in the Russian old calendar, and that's quite chilling. And as this happens, I'm kind of pulling my hair out because I'm saying, you're here to hear a talk about a book written about the Byzantine world and the Crusades. I didn't expect it to be current events. When I wrote against the militarization of the Virgin Mary in the Byzantine world, which is what my book is about, I hadn't expected it to be staring at me from my phone as I see something unfold. And so I felt the need to respond in some way, and I have not seen an adequate response to some of the things that were said. It's uncomfortable to bring this up, but again, fools rush in, and I'm going to do so anyway. So Putin said, hey, in the West, you do slavery and Native American genocide. You use nuclear bombs, and you pressure young people for gender transition surgery. And I want to say, I think those things are bad. And so I'm listening to this and I'm saying, hey, I'm in the West and I'm not a thumbs up on any of those. And then the controversial line that made headlines was, we also accuse you of outright Satanism. And therefore, I'm pondering this, and what I'm about to share with you actually happened. The day after that speech was given, and I'm kind of trying to wrestle with the fact that this is going on, as is all of the globe, I found myself in Salem, Massachusetts. Yeah, if you've been to Salem, you're going to begin to get a sense of where I'm getting at. So I'm walking around Salem. I was in the Boston area for a lecture, a retirement of a beloved friend. And there I am kind of processing this accusation of the West and his attempt to pin blame on us to keep his war going. And I look around and saw the sights. And of course, the Salem Witch Museum, sad to me that it is in a one-time church. These wonderful statues of Puritans, of course, it's a countercultural center. So I browsed the sights of Salem, and I am sitting there in the town hall, right there in front of everything, the main center of Salem, Massachusetts. And I heard someone say, Satanic Salem Tour is starting right now. And I thought maybe I misheard it, and he said it again. Satanic Salem Tour starting now. Satanic Salem. And I just was like, well, that's interesting. And so I walked up, and I wasn't going in the tour, but I introduced myself to the man. And I said, hey, can I just ask you a quick question? What's involved in the Satanic Salem Tour? So we got in a conversation because I was amazed. I'm like, well, here we are, accused by a world leader of outright Satanism. And then I hadn't met any Satanists before, but here was one. This is the man that I met. And there's the tour. And so this is what he told me. And the first thing he said, he's like, oh, well, first of all, we are the temple of Satan, not the church of Satan. They're horrible. Because they hate women, they hate gay people. We are not them. And I was like, wow. So I'm a Protestant. We're used to those splits. So I'm like, okay, I guess there's some connection points we can have here. So there's like First Satan, Second Satan Church in Salem. There is. So he goes on to that. I'm like, I didn't ask you about the divisions, but you're advertising them for me. And he went on and he said, well, by the way, we're philosophical and scientific. I don't really believe in Satan. We just believe in rebellion. Hail Satan. And so I was like, wow, fascinating. And he was, of course, doing that. It turns out he was something more of an entertainer, right? For people to give these tours. And so I kind of was relieved for a moment that, okay, we're not talking about real hardcore Satanism here. So I meet this guy, and I'm, again, trying to process that Putin makes this accusation, and then lo and behold, I had an encounter with an outright Satanist. And of course, the way that this is advertised in the high, unholy month of October in Salem, where it's so filled with tourists, is they say, well, see, the witch trials, that's what we're getting at here. The witch trials was a horrific thing. Where the Satanists and the witches were persecuted, which is why Salem becomes a center for that kind of activity. And so I've done a good bit of reading in this regard. This is a famous woman named Starhawk, and Spiral Dance is a very important foundational text for Wiccans. And so having examined this text and having being well aware of the serious scholarship by Ronald Hutton in The Triumph of the Moon that has basically taken the historical claims of many of the Wiccans and with great respect for them, permitting their religious liberty, has shown how there's really not much of a historical foundation to it at all. It's worth engaging that. But what's interesting, when I hear these witch trials, and what happens is if you pick up this book, Starhawk actually says that there were 9 million witches that were executed. 9 million. Now that's 3 million more than the Holocaust. This is the second edition of this book, fact-checked, I guess. But what's interesting is I had recently done my homework, so I kind of scratched my head. The actual number over a series of centuries, about 300 years, is about 45,000. 45,000. And so that's what the serious scholars who study this for a living say. And so when I hear the Satanic Salem Tour talk about the witch hunts, I'm a little skeptical because the numbers are inflated by 200 times, which means that Wiccans would get along in American grocery stores today. They're very used to inflation. Okay, so I'm listening to this. I'm having the conversation with him, and I'm saying to myself, here I am as an American, talking to this guy. How do I make sense of this? How do I make sense of this? What really happened in Salem? It's the question. Halloween-themed talk here tonight. What really happened in Salem? A lot of you may know this, but the facts are sobering. It is indeed true that in 1692 to 93, 20 supposed witches were executed, adding to that horrific number, that grim reality of 45,000 over several centuries. It's a horrible thing that this happened. But this also happened. In 1697, the General Court ordered a day of fasting and prayer for the tragic mistake of allowing those people to be killed. The good names of those families were formally restored, and even reparations were paid for the suffering that those families underwent. That's what happened as a result of that tragedy in Salem. And then something even more interesting happened. The Salem witch trials became the center of the American conscience in some senses. You may know Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel. He's descended from judges who participated in the witch trials. And so in The House of the Seven Gables, you can tour that house today, he tells the story of a house that was illegally seized because the owner was accused of being a witch, being connected to witchcraft, which enabled someone to take the property. And you also may realize there's a connection, right, to Wheaton. Seven Gables Park, of course, connected to that novel. And that was because there's a beautiful home there. The crown jewel, it is sometimes called, that was thankfully saved from destruction. The crown jewel of historic homes in Wheaton, also called Seven Gables. And what that is Hawthorne saying, gosh, we went too far, didn't we? Let's be on watch against that kind of angry persecution of a minority group in our community. And so it makes me proud when I drive by the Seven Gables. I think of that lesson that America learned. 100 years after Nathaniel Hawthorne, what else happened? The Crucible by Arthur Miller. He saw McCarthyism. He saw new forms of witch hunts going on, and he said, press the alarm button. As a playwright, watch out, be careful. And most recently, this has all happened again. You may know of Anne Applebaum, an Atlantic reporter, a prophetic, unfortunately, prophetic book, The Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, which she's a scholar of Russia. She foresaw much of what is happening. And in this Atlantic article, which is a distillation of her very powerful book, The New Puritans, she uses the witch trials to say, here we are again, America. Here we are again, finding our enemies, isolating them, and using the new tools, an image from the Atlantic article, to take them down, the new digital gallows. And so in some senses, I put all this together. I met this guy and I'm saying, okay, all right, I see what you're doing. You're leading a tour. And I really found myself thinking, you know what? As an American, I hear the accusations being made of us by Russia, but I think that you should be able to lead your Satan tour. And for the following reason. This is a public talk. This is not a religious talk. But thankfully, I'm in a country where I can share if I have a religious perspective, and I do. And I actually believe, unlike these people, that Satan is real. And I think his disguises are a lot more clever than this. In fact, his disguises might look like a world leader disguising territorial ambition with a thin veil of Christianity, or a patriarch using the Orthodox liturgy to fan the flames of war. And what's really devilish is this draft. And I am so grateful to be in a country where I can, if a draft comes, I could protest it. But you cannot do that right now. You cannot do that. And so I go with a heavy heart, having had that strange experience. I think what Putin is basically saying is, look at you Americans. Look at the insanity of your freedoms. This is an actual picture of a restaurant in Salem that I took. I was like, okay. And Putin is saying, see, that's who you are. And here's who we are. This is the Russian Cathedral of the Armed Forces, completed in 2020. It's an actual photograph of it at night. It's an aerial view. This is it in the daytime, deliberately shaped like nuclear missiles. And what he seems to be doing is saying the chaos of American freedom with their outright Satanism and all these ridiculous things, well, I can give you a symbol that will unify the Russian people. As I mentioned, the draft was coordinated with a feast of the Virgin Mary, and inside this church, you have images of the Virgin Mary that are galvanized for Russian aggression. They would say protection. What do we do with that? How do we respond? I think there's a good response. I learned it from Rufus Fears, the best teaching company course I've ever taken. I cannot recommend it highly enough. He died not too long ago, a wonderful historian. He taught me what the history of freedom is. And what he taught me, and I hope he can teach it to you if you take this course, is that there is a beautiful Great Barrier Reef in our culture that enables the freedom to have open discussions like we're having right now. And that barrier reef was created first in Magna Carta, and then in predecessors to our Bill of Rights, in English parliamentary checks and balances that our founders inherited. And I have an image of Federal Hall there, where the Bill of Rights was created. And that freedom that protects us enables all kinds of wonderful things to happen in this society, and some not so wonderful things. I get more and more concerned about where that barrier reef is right now. I am more concerned about, are we eroding those freedoms that have accumulated over time? Barrier reefs don't just grow overnight. And yes, I had that uncomfortable, strange encounter in Salem right after those accusations were made. But I want to tell you something wonderful about this society of ours that you, I hope, know and cherish. And that is that all kinds of wild things can happen in barrier reefs. This is a stonefish, the most poisonous fish in existence, and it'll just gobble up its prey. You don't know what's going to happen in societies where free interchange of ideas can take place. This can happen. Not a very safe place to be a Satanist in the West, because you have converts, right? I know the conversions go in other directions, but people all of a sudden say, I want to give up on this. I've encountered something more real. I don't know what to make of these. I find them on the internet, but I do know that in the neo-pagan community that I have read a good bit around about, you have an alarming series of people who've understood that world and then have changed their allegiance because they don't have a government telling them what religion they have to be a part of. There's a free interchange. This is a fascinating book where someone who mastered the tarot cards and then became a Christian. Another case of the exact same thing with Gareth Knight, an authority in the occult world. You have books like How to Be a Christian Witch by the woman Valerie Love, who's facing some tense Q&As after her presentations from the Wiccan community, who are afraid that she's not pure anymore. And she has interesting answers to that. And then most recently, you may know of Paul Kingsnorth, a major neo-pagan thinker in England who had a dramatic conversion to Christianity. And most interestingly, a friend of mine told the story of a fascinating figure, Martin Shaw. Anglican priest friend of mine, his name is Malcolm Geit. He said, well, I was contacted by Martin Shaw, and I knew him as an important figure in the neo-pagan world. And he said, yeah, I had a really strange experience in my 100-day retreat. I encountered a white stag. And I am convinced that white stag represented Christ. And what happened about a month later, and the whole interview is fully available online, is that Martin Shaw left that community and became a Christian. Again, I know that it goes both ways, but that's the beauty of the religious freedom that we have. This kind of dynamic interchange can take place. And so I can kind of listen to this person that I met in Salem, and I can say, all right, you do your thing. Can I do mine? Can I share with you my ultimate response to this propaganda that has been coming our way? Can I share with you that there is a beautiful Virgin Mary in our country too, that also communicates a unifying power and force, but with much more humility. Not far from Salem, Massachusetts, is a massive, massive basilica in the heart of Boston. And that is what the book that I have written is about. This icon is a response to the militarization, to the weaponization of Christianity. This icon may be the ultimate response to that has come down to us in the history of art. I've been pursuing her for about 15 years, starting with the beginning of my dissertation topic, and I've never gotten bored with the topic. At this basilica in Boston, there are crutches piled up next to one of the icons, testifying to miraculous healings that claimed to have occurred here. But what I really like is that those crutches are right next to Harvard Medical School. Kind of like tweaking. You guys don't have all the answers, do you? Sometimes things are beyond medical understanding. I love that. And so here we've got this. I would kind of appeal to a Virgin Mary that's, I think, more interesting and has more humility and reverence to bring into the world than what is happening in the formal leadership of Russia right now. And she is all over the Eastern Seaboard, and she is all over the United States as well. These are just dots where a church dedicated to this icon is in the United States. And so when you understand this icon, as I've been spending a lot of time trying to understand it, I really think that when I go through Salem, I don't get freaked out by the Satanic Salem tour. I mean, I did, but I talked to the guy, calmed myself down, said, okay, went to some stores. I see the Beatitudes on display in churchyards. The Beatitudes. The heart of the gospel presented for the public to see. And by the way, the sign was vandalized, which makes me wonder, is there enough freedom in that place? And when I walk through, you'll see the humility I'm about to describe is well illustrated by this icon and by that beautiful sign in a churchyard in Salem. And when I look at New Age stores such as this one, I'm going to zoom in on this image right here. What did the proprietors of this store want you to see? I love it. People are unreasonable, illogical, and self-centered. Forgive them anyway. The words of Mother Teresa advertised. And so slowly, my understanding of the richness of interreligious dialogue that happens in the West was recovered as I walked around this city. And what I want to suggest in regard to this icon I want to describe to you is that this is a javelin. It's an anti-tank weapon. And many people have pointed out that the real Virgin Mary to keep your eyes on in the Ukraine war is known as Saint Javelin. So this is an image of the Virgin that was made for fundraising purposes. It's been very successful. There she is now painted on a Kiev beautiful apartment to let people know, let's resist, let's resist. And we could talk about that all night, but it has been discussed a lot. I want to point out to you a different image of the Virgin Mary. A Virgin Mary that has been called upon for protection, the Virgin in Christ. And this image, to my delight, is found in Ukrainian bomb shelters. When this just began to take place, I noticed that, I'm like, I know what that icon is. I've been studying it for a really long time. And now it is a symbol not of aggression and violence in the name of Christianity, but instead it is a symbol of resistance, yes, but also suffering love. That's what this book is about. And I didn't expect, again, it to be so unfortunately current, which is why it's heavy on my heart as it interacts with this world we're facing right now. Let me tell you a little bit about the story. So this is Constantinople, the city of gold. Constantinople in the year 1200 is the absolute apex of the Byzantine world. In 1204, it's going to be sacked by the Venetians, and they're going to take all their stuff and bring it to Venice. And so when we're talking about Constantinople in the year 1200, we are talking about maybe the apex of Christian imperial power throughout all history. It was far larger than Paris, far larger than London at this time. It was the envy of all European kings. And we know that there was a man named Theodore Opsevdis who lived in this city. You should know his name. He should be as famous as Giotto because he lived 100 years before Giotto, the great Italian painter, and he was just as good. And so what I did in the book is I tried to imagine, we know this man existed. I tried to imagine what it would have been like for him to have lived in the great city of gold in Constantinople. There's a wonderful website called Byzantium 1200 that tries to reconstruct that city in its day. There's these computer digital recreations, but I wanted to do more than that in this book. It's one thing to do a recreation. It's another to try to enter into the spiritual mindset of someone in late 12th century Constantinople. And that's what I tried to do, using the photographs we have of the great Church of Holy Wisdom, Hagia Sophia, which of course is now a mosque because of a loss of some liberty that Turkey once had. And so I imagined myself in there. I've been there myself before, of course, when it was a museum. And I put myself in the shoes of this Byzantine painter and imagined looking up. Here's a reconstruction of what Hagia Sophia would have looked like. And I tried to describe maybe what his spiritual life might have been like as he worshiped in that church. But what happened to Theodore Opsevdis is this. For reasons we don't understand, he got exiled. And so he had to go from Constantinople, and he had to make the long journey to Cyprus. Why? Cyprus at this time is an outpost of the Byzantine Empire. They're about to lose it. I like to say that to go from Constantinople to Cyprus in 1180s, when he made the trip, would be like an American going for a nice little vacation in Hawaii in early December of 1941. What could go wrong? It's just Hawaii, right? And so he is going into the heart of an impending disaster. He doesn't know it. But what's going to happen is what will occur to Constantinople in the year 1204 is going to happen to Cyprus first. And that horror is the Crusades. By the way, Sharon Dunbar, I thought just grabbing this from Google Earth was one thing, but a wonderful student who illustrated this journey for me that I put in the book. And it's just, I imagined him going past all these ancient pagan temples to Aphrodite and Artemis and making his way to the island of Aphrodite no more, but now a Christian island, where of course the Apostle Paul was. So I imagined him on that journey, and when he got there, he met a wild man, a recluse named Neophytos. It's incredible that we have these names that come down to us. And he lived in a cave, and Theodore painted his portrait. Astonishing that a living person was depicted with angelic wings. But lest you think Neophytos is arrogant, the angels sort of seem to be making their wings his. But if you say, Neophytos, how dare you depict yourself with wings? He goes, no, it's just the wings of the angels, no big deal. They're not really my wings, right? But he depicts himself in this exalted way, a loving portrait of what I believe was a friend. They developed a friendship. And you can visit that monastery today. I've been there for Easter. And it is the Easter vigil just before. Trust me, the entire island of Cyprus worships. It's astonishing. My wife and I were in a little cafe when the Good Friday, they call it Great Friday liturgy, came by, and every time this huge street procession hit a bar, the bar would clean out. And everyone would join the procession. And they were coming for us, and we're like, okay, we better go. And then all we can remember is we're joining the procession. It's the whole island, and these two British tourists say, well, they must think we're the only sinners in Paphos. Right? And anyway, that was it. So Paphos is the town that we were in. So we just kept going. It was astonishing. And so you can still see the monastery where this beautiful image was painted. So again, what does this have to do with the Crusades? Well, Theodore gets his career going, and then this happens. And that, of course, is Parliament, which has already been discussed, the freedoms that later parliamentary liberties granted us in the Western world. And there is Richard the Lionheart. The Crusades were not working. And so they thought, the problem is we're not sending our best. So let's send the kings. So this is called the Third Crusade, the King's Crusade. Send the King of England. Well, but if he goes, then Philip Augustus, the King of France, will take all of Richard's lands. So that's not going to work. How are they going to fix this? They both go. And so we agree, okay, you go from France, I'll go from England, and we'll go conquer Jerusalem, take it back, a legitimate defensive measure. The Crusades are complicated, and then we'll come back. But the problem is they try to come back really soon so they can take one another's land. And so it totally scrambles the crusade. Nevertheless, King Richard gets to Cyprus, conquers it, sells it to these guys, the Knights Templar. And tragically, on Easter morning, 1192, the Knights, after not doing a very good job of controlling the Orthodox island, you don't tell Orthodox men to cut their beards. You don't tell them to cut their beards. That's not a good idea, because they're imposing Western Latin Christianity upon this Orthodox island. And on Easter morning of 1192, they slaughtered the population that wasn't letting them exit a castle in Nicosia. And I tried to let that sink in. This is the disaster that befell Theodore's island of Cyprus, the refugee from Constantinople, and now marooned on his island that was Orthodox no more. So what's he going to do? What he does is he goes from depicting this recluse beautifully, and he gives us history's first Virgin of the Passion, painted in direct response to the Western conquering of the island by a Crusader king. In the mountains of Cyprus, where most of the Latin Christians didn't go, and you can visit this church to this day. It is a covered church of Cyprus. And the way that I like to think of it is that Theodore of Sevdis knew that no longer could Hagia Sophias be created. That time is done. But what he could do is make a little miniature Hagia Sophia a little miniature church of holy wisdom. And that's what he accomplished in the island of Cyprus. He didn't touch this painting. This painting was before he arrived in this church. This painting depicts a relatively confident Virgin Mary with two angels on both sides. But he definitely went to town on the rest of the church. It's astonishing. You can visit it. I recommend it as a pilgrimage. And in the midst of this, he gave us an image that you can recognize from the cover of the book of not Mary confidently flanked by angels, but Mary with her son looking to his fate and saying, I got this. And his mother's very concerned. She looks to the spear and sponge. She knows what's coming. And there is a gravity and a weight because that reflected the political conditions on the island of Cyprus. Theodore knew he can't fight back. And the island was then sold to the French and it stayed French for 300 years. He could not resist. And so instead he mourned, he lamented. The theology is richly complicated and we don't have time to go into it tonight. But what I'm going to suggest to you is that this icon becomes an emblem of Christians who are put out of a position of power. Each of these images that I'm showing you are examples of this icon. You could recognize the similarities. See, there's the angel with the cross, there's the angel with the spear and the sponge, and there is a frightened Christ. Same thing in all of these. These are all throughout the Mediterranean. And they emerge as a way of saying, faced with these conditions, Christianity doesn't end. For a lot of paganism, if you lost a battle, the goddesses abandoned you. That's what it meant. Good night. But in some senses, this Christian faith with this Jesus who had already been crucified by the public authorities and rose again, we can handle this kind of thing. And when the Byzantine Empire finally fell in the year 1453, then it really took off. And this is the example of the icon that spread throughout the world. I mentioned the other night when we were talking about this at Wheaton that I love the fact that just upstairs from Michelangelo's David is this icon that my guess is an older, wiser Michelangelo would have liked a lot more than his David, because he was drawn to the ancient Christian wisdom that it represented. It's a hauntingly beautiful image, and it perfects and refines that very visual formula that first emerged as a result of the Crusades. There's a tender illustration of Jesus basically needing his shoe tied because he was so terrified by what's to come that he ran to his mother. And the tenderness of this image maybe explains why it has proliferated so widely and wisely, and this is how that happened. This is the island of Crete, and all these refugees from Constantinople, when it was finally taken down by the Ottomans in 1453, well, they may have lost the battle, but the cultural war, they won, because they were sending these images all around Europe. In the 19th century, the Pope, named Pius IX, took a liking to this image. And he said, I want you, to the Redemptorist order that were all over the world, to spread this image around the world. He gave it a new name, Our Lady of Perpetual Help. And what I find fascinating is that Pius IX was a really tough pope. He wrote the Syllabus of Errors. His nickname in Italian was Pio Nono, because he said no, no, no to all the modernists, right? And some forms of Catholics really love Pius IX for that reason. But what's interesting is that he chose the perfect icon, the perfect icon. Now, he doesn't know why, but we do with historical hindsight, because he was losing the Papal States. He did not want to lose them. He did not gladly go into that democratic night. He was forced there. And as he's losing that territory, isn't it interesting that he chose an icon that is about the loss of territory? That is the story. I'm trying to give you a sense of the complexity. You got to read the book to get the whole thing. It's rich. It's a beautiful tale. But really what it comes down to is, hey, defensive missions happen. There is, I believe, a legitimate use of military force. The Crusades have their people, their scholars who say they were a good idea. Maybe some of them were. I think it's fair to say on the long run they didn't succeed. I don't think that's controversial. But what's so fascinating to me is that if you got really into violence and you said, I want to be a Knights Templar, you can't be one. They don't exist. The only survival of those military orders are the Knights Hospitaller, and they do relief work. So if you want to be a physician or an ambulance driver, you go right ahead. You can be connected. But there is no military order. But this image is all over the world. Not endorsing one new crusade, but restraining what our contemporary crusades might be. This isn't Russia. Now I know it's Russia, right? Wake up. It's Russia. But it's not the best of what Russia is. This image that I'm showing you, the icon is called the Tikvin icon. And yes, it may have protected Moscow at one point. But did you know that the original was in Chicago? It was kept from 1949 to 2004 at Louis Sullivan's Trinity Orthodox Cathedral. I'm so disappointed that I never went to see it while I was here. And so we have a connection to that land through the Russians who live here. And what's interesting is I didn't come here to say that person who makes these ridiculous accusations, I want nothing to do with him. I want to say, I know what's in Moscow. And what's in Moscow, believe it or not, the unofficial center is not the Red Square, but the unofficial center is Pushkinskaya Square. Now, if you were to go there today, you would just see plain open streets, your typical bare, almost barren urban landscape. It's not very inspiring. There's an image of Pushkin, right? There's the remnants of the theater that after they recreated it, the Stalinists said, hey, here's a movie theater. We've gotten rid of your religion, and now you can watch films. And I remember as a kid, when this happened, the first McDonald's in Russia. Some of you may remember that too. 1990, that was in Pushkinskaya Square. And there were huge lines, and I remember the sentiment was, hey, we won, McDonald's. But there are Russians who say, you know, I want a lot more in my life than movies and Big Macs. And what's amazing is that in Pushkinskaya Square, there is a grave. And that grave, which is in this part of my book, you'll see it's pointing to Moscow, was once a convent dedicated to the icon that I just described to you, Our Lady of Perpetual Help, or the Virgin of the Passion, or Strasnaya in Russian. And what's amazing is that there is a group of people who, for the last 5 years or so, have quietly been asking for this church to be honored and not just to be a haunt of tourists. There are a few images of the processions of this icon. And what's interesting is that you might say, right, they're probably the people who are all ready to go for this war, but I'm not so sure. Because there's some really good scholarship right now that's saying that, you know what, Mary will surprise you. She confounds the secular religious divide. She belongs to no one and everyone, and she can actually inspire not just submission, but sometimes forms of protest. And as I look at photographs that I got a long time ago of women surrounding this, I am well aware that Pushkinskaya Square is the main center of resistance. Look at the date on this, December of 2021, far before the war. More protests. You didn't count our votes, that's what the sign says. And amazingly enough, I found an article, I hope this woman is okay, written by a Russian scholar that said, those activists who are arguing for this monastery, they're a different, more peaceful kind of Russian. They're not the nationalists that you hear about and that Putin is trying to galvanize. And this is an image just not very long ago at all of more protesters of the draft in Pushkinskaya Square. So I think there's an alliance perhaps between the Virgin of the Passion there and these truly brave resistors who face enormous costs because of the lack of that barrier reef. This is the last thing I'll say. These are earthen prayers that I talked about the last time I was here, the mounds of the Mississippi, and they were all over Chicagoland. And so when I was here before, I said, hey, all these great Native American realities are a Wheaton thing. Well, guess what? This is a picture of all of the churches dedicated to this icon in Chicago. All of them. I'm probably going to find more before I'm done. In fact, at one of these churches, there was a weird miracle with, looks like probably a flash malfunction. I'm not quite sure it's legit, but nevertheless. In Glenview, we found a strange image, but that happened. Strange thing. But what's really interesting is something called the miracle on Roosevelt Road, this Roosevelt Road. And that happened at this church, Holy Family. You just followed Roosevelt, you'd get there. And what this miracle was in 1994 was they kept this church from getting shut down. They raised enough money to keep it going. You may be aware of this church because when the Chicago fire happened, this church had a parishioner named Mrs. O'Leary who was blamed for that fire. Thankfully, the church is still there. It's an amazingly multiracial congregation. And there is an image of the Virgin Mary, the very one that we've been talking about, in the midst of all this with these people on the visit that I made when I was there. And what is amazing to me about the story of Mrs. O'Leary is that she basically became the scapegoat. We pinned everything on her, just like Nero pinned the blame for the fire of Rome on the Christians. We made funny songs about it, and we used her Irish Catholic the Irish Catholic stereotypes against her. We depicted her in this way, basically ruined her life, even though the reporter who made up the story confessed in 1921, just before he died, and the city of Chicago has officially exonerated her. So the punchline, the moral of the story, as I think about current events in this book, is whatever your crusade is, whether it's a group that you're targeting with all the opinions that you disagree with that are thrust upon them, I hope it has some kind of conscience. I hope that as we find fellow Americans to attack, that this icon can bring some kind of restraint. I wanted to end this talk by just saying, whatever your crusade is, just please stop. And that's so ineloquent. And so I'll simply end with the words of a great poet named W.H. Auden. The beautiful sad lines on this icon remind me of the sad lines on W.H. Auden's face. Let me conclude with these words. The end of his poem, September 1st, 1939. We must love one another or die. Defenseless under the night, our world in stupor lies. Yet dotted everywhere, ironic points of light flash out wherever the just exchange their messages. May I, composed like them of eros and of dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame. Folks, thanks for coming tonight. Some heavy material. We wanted to keep it as controversial as possible.
Thank you so much, Dr. Milliner. We do have time for questions, so just a reminder to our virtual audience to go ahead and open up your Q&A on that icon, and I think we'll start with a couple of in-person questions. So if you want to go ahead and raise your hand.
Thank you for that. Thanks for pouring yourself into this. That was obviously really exciting. What would you say to people who say this icon represents the oppression of women?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're wrestling with that in our Mary class. And I have a whole chapter where I point out that a lot of new research about the Virgin Mary shows that she actually functions in a ministerial capacity. Just like those Russian scholars said, you know what, your stereotypes of the meek and mild virgin need to be updated based upon how she actually functions in Russian society. The same thing has happened in all of Marian literature. And so there's a chapter in the book about that, George. I really appreciate that question, but it's a wonderful stereotype that we have a delightful time destroying in our Virgin Mary class. We're currently reading a book, a 10th century document called The Life of the Virgin, where she's basically telling the apostles, okay, Thomas, I want you to go to India, and you, Bart, you go to Cyprus, and she's ordering them around, she's telling them what to do. It's kind of wonderful. And so all that to be said, the Marian tradition is far more interesting than we often think. Thanks for that question.
Okay,
yes,
anything else? Hang on one second.
Oh, so sorry.
Thank you. What would you say about, or I guess what would an iconographer say, and what would you say about the Ukrainian icon of the Theotokos holding the javelin anti-tank weapon?
Yeah, in some senses, legitimate defense is, of course, I don't object to it. But what concerns me is just the violent Mary now being countered with another violent Mary. I wanted to find an undercurrent that I think is more interesting. And St. Javelin is pretty young. Check back in 10 years, see if that's still going to be around. The Virgin of the Passion has been around for much, much longer. And so I think she has more staying power in that regard. And frankly, I'm just a little bit concerned about a full-scale weaponization of Jesus's mom. It's like, oh. I mean, I don't think she was like, all right, they're taking my son out. Let's go revive a chapter of the Maccabees and take him out. All right. I mean, I don't think that was her way. And I have a really difficult time in the book because I have a colleague who teaches in the world of politics, and he deals with a lot of students who are in military careers. And so we actually came up with a debate, like, let's debate this. When is military action justifiable? And I came in the book, I came to the end and I said, look, at the end of the day, I'm not saying that there aren't moments where you do have to resist, but there are also moments when cancer gets the better of us, or violence comes to us that we never asked for and there's nothing we can do about it. And that's the situation that these icons point to. And we all know that when it comes to death, that's going to be a situation we're all in. And so that's why I feel like it just hits more bass notes, right? So thanks for that question. That's really, really important.
Okay, we have a question from our virtual audience. Someone is asking, how has the icon of the Virgin Mary affected the First Nations people?
I was so thrilled to notice that she has been embraced, this particular one, not surprisingly, right, because it's connected to territorial loss. And so I remember when I first started to study Native American stuff, I went to Rapid City, and I'm just thinking, what am I doing? I'm an Eastern Christian scholar. Why am I here? I'm just thinking to myself, the grad student formation. And then I realized, the first thing I saw was this huge icon staring back at me that I've spent all this time studying, because she's the titular icon of Rapid City, South Dakota. And she has a following amongst Native Americans for that reason. So yeah, interesting point. So I find that there's a direct connection. Oklahoma City, she's really big there as well. So I find that she actually has a fascinating following amongst Native Americans.
Okay, any other questions? Anybody else? Just gonna run to the back and see if we have any more from our virtual audience. Dr. Milliner, did you want to say anything else about the books here in the back?
Oh, that's a good point. If you would like a book, I can beat Amazon for once in my life. So I've got The Everlasting People is $15. I've got my Venmo name back there. You can do that, or cash, whatever. And then the other book, I can do it for $20, which is about at cost. But if it's a book that you would like, but please, the last thing you should feel is pressure to that. I'm really delighted that you're here. And I hope that some of these words, in particular, as you can see, what's on my heart is this reality of the freedom of speech that we take for granted in this country, that I always thought would just be around. And I'm realizing the need to protect that, to defend that. And as we do that, wonderful stories emerge. Stories like this icon, and also some less than entirely pleasant realities that I encountered in Salem. But at the end of the day, I'm glad they're around as well, because they're allowed to be. They're allowed to be.
Right, looks like we
got another question. Go ahead, sir, please.
Thank you. Sir, what's your opinion of the Bishop Oleg Verov, that we see a picture of him, with Putin, being that it's sort of like the usurpation of religion in that category?
I know.
And how many people would you say, roughly, percentile, would really follow him vis-a-vis the Greek Orthodox Church?
That's a great question. And what we are seeing unfurling before, however we get our media, is not representative of possibly heroic acts of sacrifice, of people being dragged to prisons because of their choice to do something that we take for granted here, which is say that I'm not on board with this. And so, again, I can't give an answer as to what's actually happening on the ground, but the Russian friends that I'm in communication with are saying that at this point the number is 70,000 Russians that have faced their deaths because of this decision. So again, all I can do in response to that question is say that I'm horrified by this rhetoric. I don't know the extent to which it has been assented to. I know it's easier to assent to it. And what I wish I could find out is that little band of people who were peacefully asking for the honoring of the history of that monastery, that the scholar said that they were not nationalists the way we would understand that. What's happening to them? All of this is behind the veil. So I really can't give you a good answer, but I'm glad you asked that. It's so heartbreaking.
All right, any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much, Dr. Milliner. We
Thanks
really
for coming,
appreciate
everybody.
your time. I will be sending out some links to additional resources and an email to everyone who registered for tonight's program. If you are watching the recording of this program and would like to receive those links, including the link to Dr. Milliner's website, please email me at ce@wheatonlibrary.org. That's CE for Community Engagement @wheatonlibrary.org. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Take care and have a great evening.